Welcome to Beyond the Bee, an ongoing dialogue about the past, present, and future of the B Corp movement. Co-hosts Emmy Allison and Ryan Honeyman facilitate an open and honest conversation about the B Corp movement, advise companies on how to increase their impact, and provide a deep dive into the new B Corp standards that are shaping our community. Hi, I'm Emmy Allison, and I'm joined by my co-host, Ryan Honeyman. This episode is part of a series where we dig into the next evolution of the B Corp standards. In these episodes, we are exploring the changes to the standards with knowledgeable folks in these fields. We aim to provide listeners with the knowledge and insights needed to understand and navigate this important shift towards a more just and sustainable economy. Today, we're diving into government affairs and collective action, and we will likely regularly refer to this impact topic as GACA. This new impact topic recognizes that the challenges we face as a global community, from climate change to social inequality, require more than just individual company action. It calls for businesses to actively engage with the systems that shape our world, both through responsible engagement with government and by collaborating with others for shaping our economic forces. This impact topic is one of my personal favorites as it encourages global institutions to combine powers as a force for good, collaborations across for-profits and nonprofits, public policy, and academic research. These are all creating way more opportunities for real systemic change. And why is this important? And what does it actually mean for B Corps? How will these new standards drive meaningful impact in this crucial area? To help us navigate these important questions, we are welcoming leading voices in the development of this impact area. Join us as we delve into the world of GACA and explore how B Corps are being called to step up and shape a more equitable and sustainable future through their engagement with government and collective action.
Our guest today is Grace Sun. Grace is a senior manager on the standards team at B Lab Global. She focuses on standards development for collective action, lobbying, taxes, and financial services. Prior to B Lab, she was on the investment team at JS Capital, the family office of Jonathan Soros. She started her career in equity research at Morgan Stanley. Grace graduated from New York University with a BS in finance and economics. Grace, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Ryan. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah. So Grace, maybe we could start with a bit about your background before you first got involved with B Corps. What were some of the things you were up to?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I've always been interested in what makes a company good, but before B Lab, that experience was more so from an investor perspective. So I worked first at a bank and then at a family office. And there I was conducting research, making investment recommendations, all with this objective of maximizing financial returns, so shareholder returns. But I mean, the longer I spent in finance, really like entrenched in our current economic system, the more I became convinced. And I think this is something that we all here know and can agree on. The shareholder primacy model as it exists today, it's not working. It's broken. In shareholder primacy, right, we're prioritizing financial returns. And this is oftentimes at the cost of exceeding planetary boundaries, exacerbating social inequality. Basically, the system is broken and we need a new one. And so I started researching, just looking online to understand what is an alternative economic system that can work really for all people on the planet. And I was really inspired by B Lab's theory of change. This mission towards a more inclusive, equitable, regenerative economy, it really resonated with me. And I was lucky enough to join the standards team. And so this is 4 years ago. And yeah, I'll say what really helped my career transition is that standards development actually has a decent amount of process overlap with some of the investment research I was doing. Right, you're reading like research reports, you're interviewing experts, engaging with stakeholders, you're coming up with this recommendation and a rationale. But of course, at B Lab, the subject matter, the end objective is completely different. And that's what I really love about my job here. At B Lab, our collective vision is towards stakeholder governance, right, and advancing social and environmental impact.
And what was it like for you joining B Lab in that 2021 zone? Were people at work by then, or was it still fully remote?
It was fully remote. Yeah. So when I joined, it was on a fully remote team. And we have a pretty global team. So there wouldn't have been so much in person work anyway. But I think the global nature really contributes to all the different perspectives that we get, which is especially key, of course, on the standards team and all other teams, of course. But yeah, I started back in 2021. It's wild that it's been 4 years now. The time really does fly. And yeah, I'd say I feel super lucky to work every day with a group of really incredible people. I'd say both on the team and then also, of course, the broader community, the global movement. Yeah, it's really fulfilling work.
Yes, some really dope people in the B Corp movement for sure. Grace, could you explain the fundamentals or the purpose behind B Lab creating a whole impact topic for government affairs and collective action? Why is it essential for a B Corp to engage in government affairs and collective action?
I think a summary could be individual company actions, they create incremental change. And through collective action, we can transform systems. And so, of course, like individual stakeholder company actions, these are all incredibly important in terms of the impact that the actions have and also signaling to the people around you, this is the new business norm. And then to really achieve this more like collective action, we're working together with different stakeholders, like the communities you're in, different employees, governments, other companies. This is, I think, how different stakeholders can really amplify our individual impact in ways that feel impossible alone. And so, what I'm really excited about in the new standards overall, and then also within this GACA, Government Affairs and Collective Action Impact topic, is we can really leverage this combined influence of, I think we're at nearly like 10,000 B Corps globally, almost 1 million employees, to really address the structural barriers that exist in our current system and instead work towards an economy that works for everyone. And the way that we do it in GACA is through responsible lobbying, collective action, and responsible taxes.
Yes, those sort of three core pillars of GACA: responsible lobbying, collective action, and responsible taxes. Could you briefly outline the main idea or goal behind each of the three components?
Yes. So the first one is responsible lobbying. And actually, in the standard, we use lobbying and advocacy interchangeably. So it's basically this idea that companies can influence the development of laws and regulations such that they have positive social and environmental impact. And companies can do this by engaging with public officials. They can call them, they can meet with them, or really influencing public opinion, like launching public campaigns, getting signatures for petitions. So that's the first one. And then the second requirement is on collective action. And so I just talked a little bit about lobbying. And so that's an example of collective action in our standards. And other ways companies can take part in collective action are through mentorship, external research, multi-stakeholder collaboration, and thought leadership. And the last requirement is on responsible taxes. And it's this principle that companies should pay their fair share of taxes to the right jurisdictions. Taxes are the most sustainable source of government income, and they play a really important role in financing the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs.
One thing that stands out to me with the new standards, Grace, is that there's a lot of best practices that are required, like, for example, having a grievance policy, doing collective action, but it doesn't necessarily mandate specific outcomes. Like, all B Corps have to now work on lobbying for like universally implementing science-based targets or something like that. Can you speak to that tightrope? Because I feel like this, basically what I feel in speaking with B Corps is we want to make the standards rigorous, but allow there to be some flexibility in how people meet them. But then you have some folks who are like, well, it's great to like have B Corps do collective action, but like, why not mandate like, okay, we have to all now advocate for organic standards or like regenerative business, or, like there's some in the community who want it to actually be more outcomes focused. And so can you speak to like how you have tried to balance that with GACA?
Yes, certainly. I would say in GACA, the commonality of the outcome throughout all the different requirements is we do want to achieve positive social or environmental impact. But like you noted, we do give companies some flexibility in how they get there. The main reason that we do this in GACA is to recognize that there are different company contexts, whether it's the size of the company, the industry that they're in, and really importantly, the country or the region that they're operating in. Recognizing that, of course, we're all working together towards positive impact, but different companies can choose to contribute in different ways based on what makes most sense for their context. And so I think you can really see that at play in the collective action requirement, for example. We summarize 5 different ways that companies can take part in collective action, like the examples that we discussed in a previous question. And so I think this gives companies some flexibility in recognizing that maybe I want to participate in mentorship because that is something that makes sense for me in terms of my resources, the network that I have with external stakeholders. Or instead, maybe I'm a larger company. I have even more resources and all these connections to public officials. I want to participate in public policy advocacy because that's where I see ourselves as a company making the most impact. And so, we want to give companies that optionality. That's feedback that we heard pretty consistently throughout the consultation. Please make sure that the requirements are to a reasonable extent tailored and make sense for our context, but at the same time, making sure that common thread is woven through around we're all working towards positive social or environmental impact. And recognizing that positive impact, can seem like a bit of a squishy definition, but in GACA, we do try to outline it as clearly as we can. We point to a couple different frameworks, of course, the B-Lab standards, and each of the impact topics, there's like an overarching outcome, and then in each of the sub-requirements, there's an intent summary. And so basically, whatever you're trying to achieve positive impact, ideally you can map each of that back to an outcome and intent within the B-Lab standards. But of course, it's not just the B-Lab standards in terms of what defines positive impact for the sustainability space overall. We also reference things like the UN SDGs and other multilateral credible frameworks, basically encouraging companies to, be deliberate and to be able to say, I'm taking this action and this is how it leads to positive social and environmental impact. I think that's pretty unique to GACA, this kind of optionality, a bit of a choose your own journey for companies. I do think in the other impact topics, which I'm sure my colleagues can go into far more detail on, we do try to be more specific on exactly what type of environmental outcome, what type of social outcome are we looking to achieve.
Could you say a little bit more about how the GACA standards, specifically in the lobbying policy requirement, address a company's engagement with trade associations, particularly when their positions might differ from the company's own responsible lobbying policy? What is the expectation if there's a conflict?
So within GACA, we recognize that there are a couple of different forms of lobbying. We can group them into direct versus indirect lobbying. And so direct lobbying, we kind of touched on before. Let's say a company meets like one-on-one or in a group with a government official, or they call them up. And so that'd be direct lobbying. It's just the company and the public official in this kind of one-to-one relationship. But actually, a lot of companies engage in lobbying through indirect lobbying. So there will be a third party that sits in between the company and the public official. A common way for this to materialize is through a company being a part of an industry or a trade association, and then that broader trade association lobbies for certain positions on behalf of all their different members. And so recognizing that this is a relatively common form of lobbying, we want to make sure that its potential impacts are addressed within the lobbying standard. And so what we say is that if a company is working with what we call an intermediary organization, so this is the third party that sits in between the company and the public official. So if the company is working with an intermediary organization, and this intermediary organization has a lobbying position that undermines the company's lobbying policies, in some ways could be seen as contradicting the company's lobbying policy to only lobby for positive impact, then the company is required to publicly disclose 3 different things. So 1, the company has to explain what the company's position is versus what the intermediary organization's position is. 2, the company has to explain how the company is positively influencing the intermediary organization's position, right? The company recognizes that there's a difference. What are they doing in order to try to influence the broader group to work more towards positive impact? And then 3, the company has to explain what the company's red lines are. This means the circumstances that would cause the company to stop engaging with the intermediary organization, no longer be a part of the association, as a bit of a statement, we do not agree with XYZ position that the intermediary organization has. And so we lay it out in this manner, recognizing that, the reality is that a company can be a part of an intermediary organization that has 10, 20, 100 different members. And especially based on the size of the company, there's only so much that's within the company's control in terms of how much can they really change this whole intermediate organization's positions. But we really wanted to emphasize that, yes, there are a few things within the company's control that they can do. They can try to influence the broader group. They can be clear with themselves and what their red lines are. And so we're hopeful that this results in, where there are instances of differences in a company's versus the intermediate organization's positions, that a company can wield their influence to the extent possible in order to change the intermediate organization's position towards positive impact.
Here's a hypothetical for you, Grace. Is a lot of B Corps are probably members of like their local chamber of commerce. And then those chambers of commerce might also be members of like the US Chamber of Commerce, which the U.S. Chamber of Commerce has historically been somewhat politically conservative and like advocated against climate change legislation. So how would that, like, maybe we could like think how in practice would a B Corp need to like withdraw from like their local Chamber of Commerce, or how would that work in practice, do you think?
So the B Corp would not necessarily have to withdraw. We recognize that, for example, there could be a lot of advantages, like the broader network, to being a part of a local chamber of commerce and thus a national chamber of commerce. We recognize, especially for small businesses, they do rely on that network in many different ways. And so we're not calling for an automatic withdrawal. Instead, we're asking the company to think critically about their involvement within their local chamber of commerce and be transparent with the public in terms of recognizing the company and their local chamber of commerce. There may be some differences in terms of the positions they're taking on, for example, climate action. So we're relying on is requiring that the company is publicly transparent about exactly what those differences in position are. And by being public, then there's some public accountability around the company being honest in what their efforts are to change their local chamber of commerce and thus the state chamber of commerce's lobbying positions. And the hope is to really be an agent of change, right? And in some ways, you could argue that remaining a part of that organization, there's greater potential for change than just automatically withdrawing from it. And so, we're hopeful that this public reporting mechanism can encourage companies to think critically and, to the extent possible, really change the lobbying or advocacy positions within their different, in this case, state chamber of commerce, in order to have the impact that they're seeking.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I think there are some really powerful opportunities to change minds within organizations that you have had multiple, like multi-year relationships with as a business and an organization. The requirements for documentation for the new standards, like the amount of documentation is so much higher for the B Corp new standards. I was joking with a client the other day that we need like a whole separate website for the amount of public disclosures and like the amount of information that needs to be made public because of B Corp certification specifically. I'm personally very excited about it. I don't think my clients are very excited about it. Transparency is a significant part of GACA 1, and the requirements change, obviously, they adjust for size, and then there are some adjustments for timelines, like year 0, year 3, year 5. Requirements sort of start at different times for different size companies. But the standards require publicly sharing lobbying positions and political contributions annually. Could you say a little bit more about the intent behind this question?
Yes, certainly. So the intent is to increase transparency and public accountability. I will say, just to make sure this is clear for stakeholders listening, if a company does not engage in lobbying or advocacy, they're not required to have a lobbying policy. They're not required to list lobbying positions. They're not engaged in if they're not lobbying, right? Instead, they just have to publicly disclose that they're not engaged in lobbying. That's how they would meet this requirement. It's also recognizing that in different countries, lobbying may or may not be a part of the corporate political culture. And so, just recognizing not every company is going to lobby. But if a company does choose to engage in lobbying, we just want to make sure that the right guardrails are there to ensure that their lobbying positions are advancing social or environmental impact. Just wanted to make that clear. And then to go back to your question, yes, we really want to increase public accountability because one element of this is that B Lab has a public complaints process. And so actually, if a stakeholder realizes that, a company in their public report, they're misrepresenting themselves, then the stakeholder can submit a complaint to the B Lab complaints process. And then actually one of the potential outcomes of a complaint is decertification. And so we want to ensure that, stakeholders have the information available to them in order to, as needed, submit complaints around misrepresentation. Another element of public reporting is, I think, a little more implicit, but what I think is still really critical. I think public reporting really encourages a company to think critically about, in this case, their lobbying positions, who they're contributing to in terms of political parties or representatives. So for example, let's say there is a lobbying position that a company leader, they feel comfortable sharing with their executive team. They may even feel comfortable sharing it like with the employees at their company, but with, big red letters marked internal only. But if they're required to publicly report this lobbying position, then they start having to think, oh, this is going to be public. How would the broader public respond to this position? And I think this is a great litmus test that really encourages company leaders, the company overall, to potentially update or reconsider or even change their position for the better in order to better serve public interest. And so, I think kind of just anticipating, preemptively responding to public feedback, it can be a really healthy exercise for a company and really helps ensure that the company's messaging, it's considering all these different stakeholder perspectives and aligning with the broader public interest.
One thing that is going to be, I think it's being worked out now, which is the assurance model for like all of this, right? So we don't necessarily have those answers, but I do have a question of like assessing how will B Lab assess and enforce something like this? Because theoretically, a B Corp could say, we have no lobbying positions, and then upload it to B Lab, but then like secretly they are part of like, I don't know, some bad organizations that are doing things. And B Lab as an organization is not sort of set up, I don't think, to be constantly like monitoring the entire B Corp community and looking for inconsistent positions and things. So do you think there is going to be, maybe it's the same as version 6 and before, but do you think there's going to be a sort of request to the broader community of like, can we sort of monitor other B Corps and see if like everyone's actually complying with, these new standards, or like, because it seems like it's sort of crowdsourced, like we should all be like monitoring, not a sort of like, there's like some hesitancy in saying that of like calling out people, oh, they're lying or something. But how do you see the public's role in monitoring this versus B Lab's role in assessing and enforcing it?
Yes, you are correct that our assurance model is still under development. And so there's still some details to be figured out there. What I will say is overall, you're right that when it comes to proving the absence of something, that's a different process. It's much more difficult in a lot of ways versus proving the presence of something. And so what we would try to do here is rely on, like you were saying, around the public reporting of it. A company has to publicly state, we're not lobbying, or this is the complete list of positions that we are lobbying for. And so that acts as an accountability mechanism. And then, I do think that we should elevate B Lab's public complaint process. I think one of the great things about it is that any stakeholder, any member of the public, they're very welcome to submit a complaint. And generally the identity of the complaint submitter is kept anonymous. And so if a stakeholder sees that there is misrepresentation going on, they can substantiate the misrepresentation through proof like a website or clicking through to the company's public report in this example, and then comparing it to like a reputable news article saying, oh, actually the company is doing XYZ. I think that can serve as a pretty powerful mechanism to ensure that if you're a B Corp, you are being honest about your practices, you're being honest in your public reporting of them. And so, I'd really rely on this public accountability plus some level of enforcement through this public complaints process.
Yeah. And I know with the new standards, it's going to be annual compliance for a lot of these, as opposed to like in version 6, it was just you do it and then you have 3 years. But like B Lab's not really going to look at it for another 3 years, basically, with version 6. And so I know with the new standards, it's a lot of like, it starts in year 0. I mean, it depends on what the size and end year, but it's like starts in year zero and then you have to prove it every year. And so I don't think that means that B Lab is then assessing companies every year. It's more that when it comes to your 3-year research date, you have to prove that it happened every year. Is that your understanding, Grace?
Yes, I think one of the details that's still being worked out on the assurance model includes exactly when each audit will happen and at what frequency. But let's say that the audit is every 3 years, for example, then you're correct that the company would have to prove kind of just at that 3-year mark. Yes, every year since I've last gone audited, I've published my report listing my annual political contributions, lobbying positions. So yes, that's the general idea.
Okay. And then last question, then I'll let Amy's going to move to GACA 2. The last question is, why not require all B Corps to upload these policies to like their B Corp page so that it can be easily found and reviewed, kind of like publicly traded companies have to do? Did you all balance that in this? Because if a company has it sort of like, just put it on your website in a public place, it's going to be different for every company. And so third-party people who are interested will have, maybe it's a little harder to find. Whereas if it's just like on the B Corp profile, here's a link to each proof point, it would be easier, but maybe it's too much of a burden for the companies.
Yeah, you're right that in the requirement for GACA, the minimum requirement is around publishing on the company's webpage. We're just thinking that if a stakeholder is interested in a company, then they're going to their webpage, so you can click around a little bit. I hear you on, and that is one thing that we're kind of exploring with what the B Corp profile pages could look like. I do agree that in an ideal scenario, the public profile could include links to, these are all the times we ask the company to publicly report on their company webpage, especially if it's a large company. I do think it could be a good outcome for the public profile to just include links to each of the places where the company has publicly disclosed something, just to make it easier for stakeholders. It's not just going to the company's website, but it's also you can go to the B Corp directory and then in a kind of one-stop shop place, quickly see all the public reports that the company has. And so definitely something we're exploring as we finalize the product here.
Do you know what the public profile will look like, Grace? Or is that still highly under wraps?
I do think we are going to reference the existing B Corp public profile because I know we've gotten a lot of stakeholder feedback. The public profile can have a lot of really valuable information for stakeholders. It's really helpful for us to have it all in one place. And so while the product, the new version itself is still very much in process, I do think we're hearing the stakeholder feedback that the current version is really helpful for stakeholders.
Cool. Okay. GACA 2, collective action. It seems like the goal here is for companies to work collaboratively to advance social and environmental impacts. GACA 2 outlines 5 specific types of collective action companies can engage in. Those, you were mentioning them earlier: mentoring, external research, multi-stakeholder collaboration, public policy advocacy, and thought leadership. Could you walk us through sort of what these look like within the framework of the standards?
Yes. So you listed the 5 different collective action options there. And so something that unites all of them, right, is this common intended outcome around you want to collaborate with your external stakeholders to collectively advance the social or environmental impact. And so I can give a brief summary of each of them, starting with mentorship. This is when a company teaches or advises mentees outside of their company, like someone in their industry. External research is a company supporting research initiatives outside of the company's own, research and development department. And so when we say support, we're talking about financial contributions, in-kind contributions like time or expertise or data sharing. And so examples of how a company could do this is a company can share some of their normally proprietary data with a university or a nonprofit for some type of, social or environmental research that external organization is doing. And then for multi-stakeholder collaboration, companies are working with multiple different stakeholders. A common way to do this is an industry association, but the company can also work with different academic institutions, other businesses, and example outputs could be, this multi-stakeholder collaboration. They engage together, they develop things like best practices for different industries, like industry-specific guides. They can build shared infrastructure, or they can invest jointly in community projects. And the next one, public policy advocacy. Yeah, I think we dived into this a bit with GACA 1, basically engaging with your public officials to influence legislation, influence public opinion. And the last one is thought leadership. So this is when a company speaks to kind of many different stakeholders at once, kind of a broad sharing out of expertise or insights in order to inspire action on positive impact. And so an example could be going to give a guest lecture at a university. I actually did this recently. It was super energizing. Our company could create blog posts, publish research papers, speak at podcasts like this one. And so thought leadership is kind of the broadest bucket, but also recognizing this one-to-many approach can have a lot of positive impacts around inspiring other stakeholders together.
How did you come to these? Like, I imagine, I'm just envisioning you starting with the list of like 20 things that companies could do and then like slowly winnowing it down to these 5. Like, what was that process like? Like, how did you sort of come to this as the 5 areas?
Yeah, the process was a lot around listening to stakeholders, listening to B Corps, around what are some examples of collective action that you already engage in. There's a webpage on the B Lab website that actually summarizes some of the really great initiatives that companies in the B Corp community are already engaging in. And so that was a big source of inspiration. What are B Corps already doing? And then, of course, as we publish consultation drafts, hearing their feedback on which collective actions do they think are most important, resonate with them the most, make most sense in terms of their existing infrastructure and resources. And then, of course, the other big stakeholder group is expert stakeholders, talking to a lot of different experts in the collective action space and really picking their brains on which are the actions that you see as best practice that can really achieve the most impact. And so, yeah, through this research process, both with B Corps as well as expert stakeholders, arriving at this list.
And I'm just imagining you getting hired at B Lab in 2021, and then they're like, "Hey, can you develop this entire government affairs and collective action thing?" Like, has this been your life for the last like 2 or 3 years? Is like this whole topic?
No, actually, I'm more of a recent content lead on this topic, to be honest and transparent. But I do have a lot of really great, smart, passionate colleagues who were really instrumental in leading and developing the draft for government affairs and collective action, especially the lobbying and the taxes requirements. They draw heavily from the existing requirements that B Lab has for multinationals, over, I think, $5 billion in revenue. And so, yeah, there are a lot of really sharp minds that put those together as well. Yeah, really just being super grateful for all these great minds that came before me. And then, I started leading more so in the last year or so, kind of post the second public consultation through our governance body approval, and then now leading on some of these thought leadership pieces. And it's super engaging to be able to engage with the community like this. But yeah, we're always learning.
You're the closer they brought in. They're like, "All right, bring it home, Grace." One other question on additionality. So for B Corps listening, can you describe what additionality is in the context of these standards? And like, so that a company is not, for example, using the thing they're doing for, say, like climate action as like the same points or like the same qualification in this section? Like, don't they have to be like distinct and separate in order to earn credit?
It depends on the company's size and the exact sub-requirement. Basically, there are some instances where if you're engaging in, let's say, public policy advocacy for climate action and you're a small company, you can also have that count towards your collective action requirement. But then there are other sub-requirements, and especially for larger company sizes, where you actually cannot have the same action count twice. And so, yeah, we try to be really deliberate in, if you're doing this, you can use it twice. But if you are this size company, you cannot use it twice. And so, yeah, that would be under like the clarifying the compliance criteria section in each of the sub-requirements.
Okay, GACA 3, responsible taxes. Even though this sub-requirement only applies to extra large companies, it touches on the debate about whether multinationals should be a part of the B Corp community. This topic might be less intuitively linked to quote-unquote social and environmental impact for some. And the new standards emphasize that taxes are, quote, vital in achieving the UN Sustainable Development Goals and a key way for companies to contribute to their local economies. Could you elaborate on B Lab's perspective on why a company's approach to taxes is considered a fundamental part of its impact and sustainability strategy?
Yeah, I will say in the last public consultation, there were a few questions from stakeholders. Like as we're reading through the thousands of pieces of feedback from stakeholders, there were some, especially B Corps, that asked, how do taxes even fit into sustainability? Why is this a requirement? And yeah, I'll be the first to admit, oftentimes when it comes to these broader sustainability conversations, maybe taxes isn't exactly what the most stakeholders in the room are the most excited about. I'll say I'm excited about taxes. I think the narrative around taxes and how it fits into the broader sustainability space, it definitely is evolving. But I think there are a lot of really great organizations, publications out there. Like the UN published like a tax for SDGs initiative. The GRI tax standard was really important in the development of B Lab's tax standard. And so other organizations and great research like this are really highlighting the growing importance of tax transparency in the sustainability landscape. I think that's really inspiring. So for example, with the Tax for SDGs initiative, it recognizes that taxes, they play this really crucial role in financing the UN SDGs. Right, taxes, they fund public services that support residents and the environment, things like healthcare, education, roads, utilities. Companies and their employees, they really depend on these public services in order to even operate their business. And so that's on kind of a company level, how they benefit from taxes and the public services that taxes fund. And then if you think about it on a more macro level, taxes, they reduce the need for international aid, right? They're the most sustainable source of government revenue. And so this helps governments in different countries repay their national debt and overall just really strengthens a country's ability to withstand, especially external economic shocks. Fun fact for you around taxes, or it's not that fun, actually more so shocking and saddening. Global tax havens cost governments an estimated 500 to 600 billion US dollars in lost corporate tax revenue. And given all the lack of transparency around taxes, it's kind of hard to pin down an exact number. That estimate specifically was from the IMF. But generally, we do know that there's so much lost tax revenue when it comes to companies that are engaging in tax abuse, whether that's tax avoidance, tax evasion. And so, yeah, we're hopeful that when companies, they meet the standard, they commit to a responsible tax policy, they publicly report their tax payments, this really reinforces their commitment and their contribution to tackling different social and environmental challenges.
I'm also excited about taxes. And in many areas around the world, taxes are like, the OG corporate responsibility in a lot of ways. And there's so many more touch points and decision makers and stakeholders that are involved in how those dollars get allocated. And I was really excited to see this sub requirement as part of the new standards because, yeah, it's big dollars that we're talking about here.
Yeah, certainly.
Can I ask a follow-up question? So, it's interesting with taxes because this actually came up in the B Corp community in 2017 around Etsy. It was a publicly traded company at the time. They had not dropped their certification yet, and they started a subsidiary in Ireland. And for anyone who sort of follows like world tax policy, I don't know if it's still an issue anymore, but there used to be something called like the double Irish with a Dutch sandwich, like tax situation, which basically is like companies would create an Ireland subsidiary and like a Dutch subsidiary and then like license the IP. And it was like this whole big thing, like Microsoft and Apple did it, et cetera. So when Etsy started a subsidiary in Ireland, people were freaked out. We're like, what is going on? Like a B Corp is going to do this sort of Irish tax subsidiary thing. And I talked to Jay, one of the co-founders at B Lab, and I was like, what's up with this? What are you going to do? And he's like, well, one of the challenges is that, let's say you're a US company and you're incorporated in California and then you move to Nevada, like with lower taxes for course. Is that tax avoidance? Or if you move from one city to another, like a city with lower. So he wasn't saying like this isn't an issue, but it is a challenge for B Lab to draw, like, where's the line drawn? For example, in my backyard, it's like we want to do some work. Do I get a permit from the city and like pay $2,000 or do I do it under the books? Right. So like all of us are sort of with this question of like, should we pay the taxes, not just the largest corporations? And so I'm wondering how did you balance that? And maybe why is it only double XL companies that would need to do this? Why not some of the smaller companies as well.
Yes, I will be the first to admit that taxes are a very tricky topic, very nuanced. I'm not a tax professional. There are people that spend decades of their career being tax practitioners, really getting into the weeds of it. That's not me, but I do think that over the past few years, I feel that I can speak pretty confidently on what are the best practices out there when it comes to how taxes are intersecting with a company's sustainability strategy. What are other credible nonprofits, standards organizations? What do they say are best practices? And then how can we incorporate that into B Lab standards? And so the main kind of interoperability references that we drew on for tax requirement for B Lab was GRI, their tax standard, as well as the OECD BEPS, base erosion profit shifting. They have a minimum standard on country by country reporting. And so, for the OECD, actually, they require this of multinational enterprises over a certain size. I think it's 750 million, either euros or US dollars. But basically, for the largest companies, they do require this for the member countries of the OECD. And so, drawing on some of the existing best practices out there, recognize especially larger companies are already doing this in some shape or manner. We thought that we have good rationale to say that this is an appropriate level of ambition for B Corps. In particular, when it comes to country by country reporting, it's conceptually aligned with the GRI tax standard. And we think it's reasonable for leaders in the business space to commit to this level of transparency when it comes to taxes.
Yeah. And I think the GRI tax standard is really important. I didn't actually, when I first read the standard, I was like, oh my God, this is hugely burdensome for those XXL companies to report country by country taxes and revenue and like how many employees. But then I think in the standards, it says 1 in 4 of the largest public companies already use the GRI tax standard in their sustainability reports. So have you spoken to any of the multinationals in the B Corp community of like, hey, is this going to really dramatically affect you, or are most of them already complying with that tax standard?
Yes. And I think first to talk maybe a little bit more about the GRI tax standard, because I do think it's really exciting. They built on OECD BEPS, that minimum standard on country by country reporting. That's legally required of companies of a certain size. And then what GRI kind of adds on is encouraging companies to publicly disclose information that they're sharing with authorities, publicly disclose their country by country report. And then as part of the country by country report for GRI, an additional element that they require is that a company explains, just in like a narrative, a few sentence summary, the reasons for any difference between the tax accrued on profit and the taxes due if the statutory tax rate is applied to profits before tax. So to say this in a bit more plain English, I guess, if a company is operating in country A's corporate tax rate is 20%, but the company is only paying 15%, then the company has to disclose this, of course, and then also explain these are the XYZ reasons why, even though the corporate tax rate in this country of operation is 20%, we're only paying 15% because, and there could be good reasons, for example, subsidiaries for renewable energy. There could also be less good reasons, let's say. And so I think putting this accountability on the companies to be publicly transparent about it then gives stakeholders, one, a pretty quick way to identify, like in this and this and this country, this company is actually underpaying their taxes. And then through the company's explanation, the stakeholder can then make a judgment call whether or not the company's explanation makes sense. And then your question around, have we brought this out for consultation with especially the largest companies in the B Corp community? So in the second consultation draft, there was a tax requirement, and there was GACA 3. That draft required disclosure of a global tax rate rather than country by country reporting. And companies' feedback on disclosing a global tax rate, there weren't any specific attainability concerns. Again, there were some questions on how does this tie into our sustainability strategy, but there weren't any attainability concerns around reporting their global tax rate. The reason why we updated GACA 3 to better align with existing best practices like GRI was because as part of the second consultation, of course, we engaged again with experts, and we received some expert feedback that as part of B Lab's tax standard, we should reference country by country reporting because it's best practice as per, for example, GRI, OECD. And so GRI tax standard actually was developed with a technical working group. So a lot of experts in the space on taxes specifically. And they also underwent, they being GRI, years of research, public consultation. That they also have a public summary of their consultation feedback. And then they're actually, like when you read through GRI's summary of the feedback they heard during public consultation, there are some like clarifying questions and comments, but again, there aren't really attainability concerns. It wasn't so much companies saying we can't do this. They're asking, oh, like, what do you mean by an explanation of the difference in tax rate, for example? And then, as you mentioned, GRI actually published an article, I think last year, stating that of the largest companies globally, 1 in 4 are using the GRI tax standard in their own reporting. And that's a pretty encouraging number, just seeing that an increasing number of, especially the largest companies that should be paying the most in taxes and thus can have the most impact on a country's tax revenue, that they are hearing that this is best practice now and engaging and publicly reporting as per best practice. And so I thought the article was a really great summary of the ways in which the GRI tax standard has been implemented. And so yeah, since we did put out a version of this for the second public consultation feedback, we as in B Lab, and then also knowing that the standard as it was published last month is based on GRI's research, stakeholder engagement, and also the fact that for like OECD base erosion profit shifting, that minimum requirement on country by country reporting, again, that's mandatory for MNEs and member countries. And so yeah, overall, we as B Lab feel comfortable that GACA 3.2 on country by country reporting represents the right level of ambition for B Corps, especially since it's only for the XXL B Corps.
Cool. This is the first, version of the new standards, and the standards will continue to be improved as they have been historically, and it's probably way too soon to think about the next version of the new standards. But do you think that this sub-requirement around tax transparency might start trickling down to other size companies as well?
Yeah, it does seem like in current legislation, like with this OECD BEPS, they do focus on only the largest companies. I would imagine part of their rationale is that it's oftentimes largest companies that have the most contrived, artificially created tax structures, where they have tax structures and 20 different tax havens, and they're reducing their profits, arguably artificially, in order to pay less taxes. It does seem like the largest companies are most likely to engage in tax abuse practices. So I'd imagine that's part of the reason why it's kind of focusing on these largest companies. But I think that as tax transparency, and especially on a country by country reporting basis, becomes the new normal for the largest companies, I can see it trickling down to smaller companies. Not if you're for example, even if you're a medium company, but you're only operating in one country, there's less likelihood that you're engaging in tax evasion, tax avoidance. I think the biggest risk lies with, these larger companies that have subsidiaries in a lot of different countries. So I could see it trickling down if it's clear that there's a certain size of company that we're not capturing that is engaging in a lot of tax avoidance practices.
When you think about the government affairs and collective action topic to drive systemic change, the requirement to lobby only for positive impact, the demands for robust collective action tailored by size, and the call for tax transparency through country by country reporting, what do you see as the biggest overall challenge or opportunity for B Corps in navigating this new impact topic?
I think a lot of GACA, the requirements do depend on collaboration with external stakeholders, particularly the collective action piece. And so a lot of B Corps are already involved in some form of collective action. But yeah, for some B Corps, this may be new, which represents a challenge, especially if they have to, coordinate with external stakeholders. And so a bit of a challenge. I think it could also be a really exciting opportunity for B Corps to work really closely with their local community of B Corps and other nonprofits, other actors in the sustainability space, for them to collectively identify different resources and network opportunities in order to engage in collective action.
Yeah, I'm really excited about, there's so many opportunities, as you mentioned, in their local communities. Some global regions call them B-locals. And I think that's where a lot of impact is the deepest, when you're working at sort of the municipal level, the state level, or your regional level. And then I'm also really excited for folks to start organizing around topics. And I think we'll see some of that in places like the Beehive and some crossover episode between a lot of different communities around the world. So I'm really excited to see how that manifests.
Me too. Yeah. Yeah. I think one really great potential opportunity is actually I'm working with B-Lab US and Canada. We're going to connect with some folks from the B Academics organization. And so even right now, I mean, I think there's a kind of open call for if B Corps or B Academics or different players there are interested in engaging in, for example, external research. That seems like a good, relevant collective action option there. Then yeah, there's definitely opportunities to email each other, have meetings, kind of this one-on-one. We're also exploring, could there be kind of a broader, almost discussion forum, discussion board where different players, different actors could post, I have this type of data, this is the industry I'm in. We think it would be interesting to partner with like another nonprofit or another academic institution to explore a thesis or a research point even further. And so, yeah, I agree. I think there's a lot of really, really interesting potential for even greater collaboration amongst all the different great players involved within our movement.
One other question that I've been thinking a lot about, this applies to the existing / older version 6 standards and to the new standards, which I think is the perennial challenge for us in the B Corp world, is what does compliance with these standards look like versus embodying the standards? So like actually making them a part of your, like, for example, I could have collective action where I sort of meet the requirements of this standard, but not really embody and like fully live into that in a way that I could if I, there's like a set of actions that are additional to each of these like standards that really allow, I think, B Corps to sort of unlock and lean into that like next level. And I'm hoping these new standards allow us to shift more into that embodiment and like really living the standards as opposed to just like it's an annoying compliance exercise, which not every B Corp has felt that way, but I know there are some. Do you have any, it's sort of a big question for you, Grace, but do you have any like thoughts, or has this come up for you in like thinking about designing these standards? And are there any tips or advice you might offer B Corps like lean into that like more embodying side as opposed to just meeting the minimum requirements?
I will say that as we were developing these new standards, we recognize that the compliance work that companies have to engage in could be quite substantial. And we don't want companies to have to create a piece of paper or create a process just for the sake of the paper or the process. We try to be really intentional and deliberate in that each of the requirements, the intention is to achieve whatever outcome the requirement is looking for. And so the hope is that there is minimal kind of incremental compliance burden, but rather the focus of what the standards require is around the impact, whether it's environmental impact, social impact, implementing a stakeholder governance model. And the hope is that the company is able to implement these actions in a way that makes most sense within the context of their own existing reporting structures, processes, and such that the overall kind of experience can really be focused more so on the impact and the action that the company is taking.
I agree. I think the new standards are really framing up like proof as how does this manifest in the company on a day-to-day basis, or how are your stakeholders engaged in this particular sub-requirement? How are you sharing this information? How are you publicizing this information? How are you operationalizing this information? And I appreciate that about this version of B Corp standards.
Grace, maybe to move into the last two questions here, what do you need right now and how can the listeners help support your work?
Well, I think first, I'd love to start with just a huge, huge thank you to everyone who has in the past engaged with, supported our work. I think I saw a number from one of our publications. We've drafted the standards over multiple years, right? And we've gotten 25,000+ pieces of feedback from more than 3,000 stakeholders. And so just the extent of the engagement and the feedback has really been inspiring. And so, yeah, just a lot of gratitude for everyone who's engaged with the standards thus far. And you've played a huge role in just supporting the process over the last few years. In terms of what we need going forward, I think maybe one call to action could be like even for stakeholders that are not B Corps, So other companies that are interested in B Corp certification or just all companies in general, I think we could, maybe encourage you to review the standards, even if certification isn't your ultimate goal, even just reviewing the standards and being aware and kind of treating them as best practices, as recommendations. I think that could go a long way. There's a lot of content, so feel free to hone in on one or two impact topics that are most material for your company and your context. And to the extent possible, just identify ways to implement like 1 or 2 or 10 of the requirements within your company in order to achieve that positive social or environmental impact that the requirements are seeking. And every individual action counts, right? Because collectively, we're all contributing to systems change.
Awesome. And last question, how can we learn more about your work?
I think the resources sections and the standards would be a great way to learn more about the thinking and all the other really excellent work that other organizations have put out on all these different topics. Standards development it's a collective process. We at B Lab and other organizations as well, we all rely on the expertise and research that other incredible organizations have put together. And so, I'd point to all the resources under, I think there's a pretty good list under like the multi-stakeholder collaboration, collective action options. If I did call out a couple additional favorites, maybe the responsible lobbying framework, and then of course the GRI tax standard. And then other ways to learn more, I think would just be to stay in touch with your local B Lab community for future updates. And then I think those are some of the ways to learn more about our work. And overall, I think we on the standards team and B Lab overall, we recognize, standards alone, just on a piece of paper or on a static website, that alone does not achieve impact. It's really the movement and all the different B Corps and community members really engaging with and implementing the standards that's really achieving the social and environmental impact. And so looking forward to continued collaboration and working together towards systems change.
Yes, it has this process for evolving the new standards really has been such a true team effort. And we appreciate the folks at B Lab for leading us through. Thank you so much for joining us, Grace.
Thanks so much for having me, Emmy and Ryan. It was really lovely to be here with you all and chat on the new standards.
Right. Hey, Beyond the Bee listeners. If you're looking for even more inspiring conversations with leaders on the front lines of our movement towards just futures, be sure to subscribe to Next Economy Now, produced by the team at Lyft Economy. Next Economy Now broadens the focus beyond the B Corp movement to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, democratic, equitable, racially just, and whole systems approach to creating the new economy. Check out our latest episodes at lifteconomy.com/podcast. You can subscribe to Next Economy Now on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts.